So the next section, O, is kind of the downer section of the lecture. It's the relative limitations of homeopathy. So we've talked all about how great homeopathy, but there are some limitations. The first being errors of lifestyle and hygiene. And I like that term that Hahnemann used to use, errors of hygiene. So it really, instead of saying, well, maybe that was a bad choice, it's like, no, it's a mistake. You know, it's a mistake to consume artificial foods. It's a mistake to consume toxins and put them in the body. It's an error. So the more we do that, the less we take care of ourselves, the less the homeopathy is going to work, the less it's going to help us. So that's looking at diet, our food, our exercise, how much sleep we're getting, how much stress we're exposed to, and how we deal with that stress, how we choose to deal with it, the quality and the amount of water that we're drinking, getting fresh air, being exposed to the sun. We talked about vitamin D last time. So all these things are really important, and the better job we do with these things, the better job the homeopathic remedies can do to help trigger a healing reaction. So for example, someone comes to see a homeopath because they're tired all the time, they're fatigued. Well, if in the course of the history we find out that they're fatigued because they're not scheduling enough time to sleep, it's not that they can't fall asleep, but they're only allowing 5 hours of sleep a night because they're working 2 jobs, and you know, the remedy for that patient is sleep, not, you know, something to take orally. And there's very little that a homeopathic remedy would do, you know, given that. Now, if those things are in place, if you're sleeping a reasonable amount and eating a reasonable diet, then you should be feeling reasonably healthy, and if you're not, then the remedy should be able to trigger a healing reaction to allow that to happen. Similar kind of thing for diseases like high blood pressure, hypertension, diabetes. These things are so linked to diet and exercise that if those are not in place, it's not very likely that a homeopathic remedy is going to improve those kinds of diseases. It may and it may not, but it's more like probably a 50-50 chance that the remedy is going to help to some degree versus be curative. The other thing is just stress. There's physical stress, like getting into an accident or falling. There's mental stress. There's emotional stress, and then there's chemical or environmental stress, like consuming a poor diet, consuming toxins, taking a lot of prescription medication. I think we talked about this before. A homeopathic remedy will not interfere with the action of any drug. There's not one drug known that is contraindicated to give a homeopathic remedy along with. There is no remedy that you can't give along with any other drug that will interfere with the drug's ability to work. But on the other hand, a lot of drugs suppressing symptoms can interfere with a remedy's ability to trigger a healing reaction, because the body is going to react to the biggest stimulus that it's confronted with at that time. So if you take a remedy and then you're exposed to a lot of stress, the body may start to react not so much to the remedy but more to the stress, and so the remedy will need to be repeated much more often with less result. Same thing with these drugs that are suppressing symptoms. We don't typically take patients off of drugs if they're on them when they're starting treatment, but we need to keep in mind that the remedies may need to be repeated much more often if symptoms are constantly being suppressed. And we can expect that until we start to get some improvement and we can start to wean the patients off of the drugs responsibly and appropriately, and oftentimes with the supervision of the prescribing doctor. But once we can start to do that, then we see even more improvement. Which is another way that homeopathy improves health, because if we can deal with things like colds and flus and simple everyday things that is the focus of this course with homeopathy, then that's so many less chemicals you're putting into your body. So not only are you helping your body heal from those things, but you're not doing the harm. You know, the Hippocratic Oath, the first rule of medicine is first do no harm. And homeopathy allows us to accomplish that goal of getting healthier without the drugs. So it kind of becomes a vicious cycle, but in a good way. Another limitation of homeopathy is when you have a disease where it involves degeneration or destruction of tissue. So in the beginning stage of arthritis, for example, homeopathy can do a great job of decreasing the inflammation and pain, and the patient does much better. So if you are decreasing the inflammation, you're interfering with the inflammatory response, which is a good thing, and the end result of the inflammatory response, though, is the degeneration of tissue. If you let the inflammatory response go for so long, for so many years, the tissue starts to degenerate and wear away, and that's a limitation of homeopathy, because if you have degeneration to the point where you get bone rubbing on bone with no cartilage in between, that's hard to restore 100% cure to full function and no pain. Although there are times when, even in the case of a certain amount of degeneration, you can still get huge improvements, because it's not, in these cases of disc herniations and osteoarthritis, it's not just the anatomic lesion that you can see on an x-ray or an MRI that's causing the problem. It's the body's response to it. So you can have a spinal disc pressing on a spinal nerve root, which is going to cause pain, but it's not necessarily just the fact that the disc is pressing on the nerve that's causing pain or symptoms. It's the body's response to that. So some people may have a little bit of a disc bulge pressing just a little bit on neural tissue, and it's causing a huge inflammatory pain reaction. It's almost like an allergy. It's like overly sensitive. Whereas other people can have a relatively larger disc bulge pressing on a nerve more significantly, occluding the space where the nerve is exiting the vertebrae, and they feel fine, and it doesn't interfere with their function. So it has to do more with the body's response to these problems than it does these anatomic problems themselves. It's the same thing with cholesterol. Cholesterol is not the causative factor in heart disease, it's the body's response to it. There's an inflammatory response oftentimes to cholesterol that ends up causing the plaquing. But if there's not that inflammatory response to begin with, some cholesterol or a little bit of blockage doesn't necessarily mean it's a huge risk factor for heart disease. So it really depends on the body's response. Another limitation to homeopathy is what we call defective diseases, defective patients, defective cases. So a defective disease is one in which there really, by definition of the disease, there really are no characteristic symptoms to discover or that are present. So in the case, for example, cancer is a really good example. Oftentimes, especially in the early stages of cancer, there are no symptoms. That's why it is oftentimes can be so fatal or problematic, is that there are no symptoms until it comes on later on. So if you detect that there is a cancer in an early stage, if there's no symptoms coming from it, there's really no way to prescribe a remedy for it. Right? That's a limitation of homeopathy. We need active symptoms in order to prescribe, to some degree. And I say to some degree because there are characteristics of people that we can use to prescribe, even though we don't have necessarily characteristics of disease. So even though there's no symptoms of cancer, we still have a patient who craves certain foods, who has better energy at one part of the day and worse energy at a different part of the day. So so that's why we're calling these relative limitations of homeopathy, not complete